The October rain drummed against the courthouse windows like impatient fingers, each drop echoing the anxiety that had settled in Tommy Chen's chest 3 months ago. He sat in the back row of the municipal auction room, his worn leather jacket still damp from the sprint across downtown Portland's slick streets. The auctioneer's voice droned on, a monotonous cadence that matched the grey sky outside. Next item, Lot 47, abandoned property at 1247 Maple Grove Avenue. Former St. Augustine's Catholic Church, built 1952, condemned 2019 due to structural violations and, the man squinted at his notes, other municipal infractions. Tommy's fingers traced the scar on his palm, a reminder of his last day at Morrison and Associates, when he'd cut himself on broken glass while clearing out his office. 6 years as their senior accountant, and it all ended with handcuffs and headlines. Portland CPA embezzles $400,000 from charity foundation. Except he hadn't. But try explaining that to a jury when your own business partner had orchestrated the perfect frame job. Richard Morrison had needed a scapegoat for his gambling debts, and Tommy, quiet, methodical, immigrant Tommy who never made waves, had been the perfect choice. The Korean-American accountant who'd worked weekends, missed family dinners, and trusted the wrong people. "Do I hear $50? The auctioneer called. Silence filled the room like stale air. Tommy looked around at the scattered attendees, mostly real estate vultures and salvage dealers who'd lost interest the moment they heard condemned. The church had been rotting for 5 years, its congregation dissolved in scandal when Father Martinez was arrested for tax evasion. Nobody wanted a building with that kind of history. $30. More silence. Tommy felt something stir in his chest. Not hope exactly, but a distant cousin of it. Since his release from minimum security prison 8 months ago, he'd been living in a studio apartment above Kim's dry cleaning, his mother's business in Old Town. The smell of chemical solvents had become the soundtrack to his shame. 20? A homeless shelter had fallen through when they discovered asbestos in the basement. The city just wanted it off their books, another eyesore erased from Portland's gentrification map. $10? Come on, folks, it's a classic mid-century structure. Needs work, but 10 cents. The words left Tommy's mouth before his brain could stop them. Every head in the room turned toward him, 20 pairs of eyes ranging from amused to pitying. The auctioneer paused, pen hovering over his ledger. "I'm sorry, did you say 10 cents? Heat flooded Tommy's cheeks, but he nodded. 10 cents? "Sir, this is a legal minimum bid in Oregon is 1 cent for condemned municipal property," Tommy interrupted, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm offering 10 times that." The auctioneer glanced at the city attorney, who shrugged and whispered something about cutting their losses. Outside, thunder rolled across the Willamette River like God clearing his throat. "Going once, going twice." The gavel fell with a hollow crack that seemed to echo through Tommy's ribs. "Sold to the gentleman in the back for 10 cents. 2 hours later, Tommy stood before St. Augustine's like a man facing his own grave. The building squatted on a corner lot where Maple Grove met 13th, its red brick facade streaked with moss and neglect. Gothic windows stared blindly at the street, their stained glass long since replaced with plywood sheets spray-painted with gang tags. The copper spire had turned green as old money, and several roof tiles had slipped like loose teeth. But it was his now, for the price of a penny candy. The key the city attorney had given him felt heavier than it should, an old brass thing that belonged in a museum. Tommy approached the main entrance, past a hand-painted sign that read, "Condemned, do not enter," in faded red letters. Someone had added graffiti below it. "God has left the building." The lock turned with surprising ease, as if the building were eager to reveal its secrets. The door opened onto darkness thick enough to taste. Tommy fumbled for his phone's flashlight, and the LED beam cut through shadows that seemed to have weight and substance. His footsteps echoed in the nave, each sound multiplied by neglect and emptiness. The church was bigger than it looked from outside. Rows of wooden pews sat like sleeping congregants, their surfaces scarred by decades of prayer books and restless hands. Water stains bloomed across the ceiling like divine bruises, and pigeons had claimed the choir loft as their personal cathedral. But there was something else. A smell beneath the dust and mold, metallic and organic. Tommy had encountered it before during his brief stint as a crime scene photographer in college, the smell of secrets that had fermented too long in darkness. His phone rang, the sound sharp enough to make him jump. The caller ID showed his mother's number. "Tommy, where are you? Mrs. Park said she saw you at courthouse today." "I'm fine, Mom. Just handling some business." "What business? You have no job, no money, no—" "I bought a building." Silence stretched across the line like a held breath. Then, "You bought what? With what money?" 10 cents. It's a church, Mom. Maybe I can fix it up, rent it out, start over." "Tommy." His mother's voice carried the weight of disappointment and love in equal measure. "Churches are for God, not for making money. Maybe God wants me to fix it." She made a sound that could have been laughter or weeping. "Be careful, son. Sometimes the cheapest things cost the most." After she hung up, Tommy stood in the darkness, listening to the building breathe around him. Old structures had their own rhythms, settling foundations, expanding wood, wind finding gaps in mortar. But there was something else, a sound he couldn't quite place. Like whispers in a language he almost understood. He moved deeper into the church, past the altar where a massive crucifix hung askew, Christ's painted eyes following him with ancient sadness. Behind the altar, a narrow door led to what must have been the priest's quarters. Tommy tried the handle and found it unlocked. The room beyond was small and spartanly furnished. A single bed, a wooden desk, a shelf lined with theological texts in Spanish and Latin. But it was the basement door that caught his attention. Unlike everything else in the building, this door looked new. The wood was unweathered, the hinges bright with fresh oil. Someone had been maintaining this part of the building. Tommy descended the stairs, his phone's light dancing across cinder-block walls painted institutional green. The basement was larger than he'd expected, stretching beneath the entire nave. Industrial shelving lined the walls, most of it empty except for Christmas decorations and moldy hymnals. But in the far corner, partially hidden behind a furnace that hadn't run in years, stood a safe. Not just any safe, a commercial-grade Mosler double guard from the 1980s, the kind banks used for their most sensitive documents. Tommy had seen similar models during his accounting days when he'd helped clients secure their most valuable assets. This safe was newer than the church's closure, probably installed within the last few years. Someone had gone to considerable trouble and expense to put it here. Tommy approached carefully, as if the metal box might detect his presence. The combination dial gleamed dully in his phone's light, and he noticed something odd. Wear marks around the numbers, patterns that suggested frequent use. Specifically, heavy wear on 0, 3, 6, and 9. He tried several combinations: 0, 3, 6, 9, 9, 6, 3, 0, 3, 0, 9, 6. Nothing. Then he noticed something else. A small crucifix etched into the metal above the dial, so subtle it was almost invisible. Below it, scratched in tiny letters, Matthew 6:21. Matthew 6:21. Tommy's Catholic school education stirred to life. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He tried 6210, nothing. Then, on impulse, 0621. The dial clicked, the heavy door swung open. Inside, stacks of cash rose like green towers, bound in bank bands and wrapped in plastic. More money than Tommy had ever seen outside of movies. The bills looked old but well preserved, mostly hundreds and fifties, organized with military precision. His hands shook as he lifted one stack. The band read $10,000 in faded ink, and there were dozens of identical bundles. He did quick math, counting rows and columns, his accountant's brain automatically calculating totals. $52 million, give or take. Tommy sat back on his heels, staring at enough money to solve every problem he'd ever had. Enough to pay back the charity foundation, clear his name, start over somewhere clean. Enough to buy his mother a house, send his nephew to college, disappear into a new life where nobody knew about handcuffs and headlines. But even as the possibilities bloomed in his mind, a colder truth settled in his stomach. This wasn't treasure, it was trouble. People didn't hide $52 million in an abandoned church unless they planned to come back for it. And people who dealt in this kind of cash weren't the forgiving type. His phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number. The money in the church belongs to us. You have 48 hours to return it or join Father Martinez in hell. Tommy's blood turned to ice water. Father Martinez, the priest who'd been arrested for tax evasion, who died in prison 6 months later, supposedly from a heart attack. Suddenly the basement felt much colder, and the shadows seemed to move with purpose. Tommy grabbed 2 stacks of bills, $20,000, and stuffed them inside his jacket. If he was going to die, at least his mother would have something. He was halfway to the stairs when the lights went out. Not his phone. The basement lights he hadn't even realized were on. Someone had cut the power, and in the absolute darkness that followed, Tommy heard the sound he'd been dreading. Footsteps on the floor above, heavy boots moving with purpose through the nave. At least 2 people, maybe more. They weren't trying to be quiet. They wanted him to know they were there. Tommy held his breath and listened to his heartbeat drum against his eardrums. The footsteps paused directly overhead, near the altar. Then a voice called down, accented with something that might have been Mexican. "Tommy Chen, we know you're down there. We know what you found." A different voice, younger and hungrier. "Boss says bring you up alive. I vote we drag your body up instead. El Santo wants to talk to him first. Nobody touches the accountant until he gets what he needs." El Santo, the saint. Tommy had heard that name whispered in the county lockup, a sicario so efficient and brutal that even hardened criminals crossed themselves when speaking of him. If the stories were true, El Santo had earned his nickname by leaving rosaries with his victims, as if murder were a form of prayer. "You got 5 seconds, Chen, then we come down and get you." Tommy looked around the basement desperately. The safe was still open, $52 million mocking him in the darkness. There had to be another way out. Old buildings always had hidden passages, coal chutes, something. 5. Nothing. Just cinder-block walls and empty shelving. 4. Wait. Behind the furnace, near where he'd found the safe, a draft of cold air that didn't belong. Tommy crawled toward it, following the breeze to its source. 3. A loose cinder block, almost invisible in the foundation wall. Beyond it, darkness that smelled of rain and freedom. 2. The block came free in his hands, revealing a hole just wide enough for a desperate man. Tommy could hear the footsteps heading toward the basement door. 1. He squeezed through the gap, emerging into the storm drain that ran beneath Maple Grove Avenue. The tunnel was narrow and reeked of decades of urban runoff, but it was moving water, which meant it led somewhere. Behind him, he heard voices in the basement, angry Spanish words that needed no translation. They'd found the safe, found the missing 20,000, and now they knew exactly how much trouble Tommy Chen was in. As he crawled through the drainage tunnel, concrete scraping his shoulders and the stolen money pressed against his ribs, Tommy realized his mother had been right about one thing. Sometimes the cheapest things cost the most. And he was about to learn that in God's house, some debts could only be paid in blood. The storm drain spit Tommy out into the Willamette River like an unwanted confession. He emerged gasping and shivering behind a concrete embankment, his clothes soaked through with October rain and something far less pleasant. The $20,000 pressed against his chest felt heavier than the water in his lungs. Above him, Portland's skyline glittered with corporate logos and coffee shop signs, a civilized world that suddenly felt as distant as heaven. Tommy pulled himself onto the muddy riverbank and checked his phone, cracked screen, but still functional. 3 missed calls from his mother, and 7 new text messages from the unknown number. You can't hide in the water forever, little fish. We know where your mother works. Kim's Dry Cleaning on Morrison Street. Pretty old building. Fire hazard. Tommy's blood crystallized in his veins. These people, whoever they were, had done their homework fast. Too fast. Which meant they'd been watching him long before he'd stumbled into St. Augustine's. But why? What made a washed-up accountant worth surveillance? His phone buzzed with an incoming call. Unknown number, but not the same one from the texts. Against every survival instinct he'd developed in prison, Tommy answered. Mr. Chen. The voice was calm, professional with the faint trace of a southern accent. My name is Special Agent Sarah Mitchell, FBI. I believe you're having a very bad day. Tommy crouched lower behind the embankment, watching the church's Gothic spire in the distance. Lights moved behind the windows now, flashlights sweeping through his 10-cent cathedral like fallen stars. How did you get this number? Same way I know you discovered approximately $52 million in cartel money an hour ago. Same way I know Hector Morales, that's El Santo's real name, is currently tearing apart your new property looking for both you and his missing cash. Tommy felt the world tilt sideways. The FBI knew about the money, which meant this was bigger than a simple drug stash, much bigger. I don't know what you're talking about. Agent Mitchell's laugh was sharp as broken glass. Mr. Chen, you're holding $20,000 in sequential bills that were part of a DEA sting operation 3 years ago. Every note is photographed and catalogued. You're literally carrying federal evidence against your chest. The stolen money suddenly felt radioactive. Tommy looked around wildly, expecting SWAT teams to emerge from the shadows. But the riverbank remained empty, except for a homeless man pushing a shopping cart full of recyclables. What do you want? Right now? I want to keep you alive long enough to testify. El Santo has killed 17 people in the last 2 years, including Father Martinez. That sweet old priest wasn't running a tax scam. He was laundering money for the Sinaloa cartel. When he got arrested and decided to cooperate with us, somebody made sure his heart stopped beating. Tommy's mind raced through the implications. You were using him as an informant. We were trying to. Martinez reached out to us 6 months before his death, said he wanted to make things right with God. He'd been hiding cartel money for 15 years, ever since they started using Portland as a distribution hub. The church was just one of dozens of stash houses. But he died before he could tell you where the money was hidden. Exactly. We've been watching St. Augustine's ever since, waiting for someone to come collect. We just didn't expect that someone to be a recently paroled accountant with a 10-cent building permit. Tommy stood up slowly, water dripping from his jacket like penance. In the distance, he could see vehicles arriving at the church, not police cars, but black SUVs with tinted windows. Professional transportation for unprofessional people. So what now? You arrest me for finding money I didn't know was there? Now you help us catch the people who killed Father Martinez, and in return, we make sure your mother doesn't become collateral damage. The threat was delivered with bureaucratic politeness, but it hit Tommy like a physical blow. The FBI wanted to use him as bait, dangling him in front of cartel killers like a worm on a hook. There has to be another way. Mr. Chen, 3 hours ago you bought an abandoned building. Now you're wanted by some of the most dangerous people in North America. There is no other way, only degrees of survival. Tommy's phone buzzed with another text from the cartel number. Your mother closes the dry cleaning shop at 9 p.m. alone. Shame if something happened. Agent Mitchell's voice continued. I'm sending you an address. Safe house on the east side. Get there in the next 30 minutes and we can discuss keeping your family breathing. The line went dead, leaving Tommy alone with the sound of the river and his own hammering pulse. Across the water, Portland's lights reflected like scattered coins, all the wealth and safety of a city that no longer belonged to him. His mother's shop was 12 blocks away. Kim's Dry Cleaning occupied the ground floor of a brick building that had survived 3 generations of urban renewal. Tommy's mother had bought it in 1987 with money saved from 16-hour workdays and dreams deferred for her son's education. The neon sign flickered Korean characters and English words in equal measure. Expert cleaning, same-day service, family-owned. Tommy watched from across Morrison Street, hidden in the doorway of a closed tattoo parlor. Through the shop's plate-glass window, he could see his mother behind the counter, her grey hair pulled back in the same practical bun she'd worn for 20 years. Mrs. Park from the neighboring restaurant sat in the plastic chair reserved for customers, the 2 women sharing tea and gossip as they had every evening for a decade. It was 8:45 p.m. A black Escalade turned the corner and parked directly in front of the shop. Tommy's chest tightened as 3 men emerged from the vehicle. The driver was massive, his neck thick as a tree trunk, with prison tattoos visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves. The passenger was younger, wiry, with the restless energy of someone who enjoyed his work too much. But it was the 3rd man who made Tommy's blood freeze. El Santo looked nothing like the monster from Tommy's imagination. Medium height, unremarkable build, wearing a grey suit that could have belonged to any middle manager in corporate America. But there was something in the way he moved, a predatory stillness that reminded Tommy of documentaries about sharks. The man carried himself like violence was a language he spoke fluently. They entered the shop with the casual confidence of people who'd never met meaningful resistance. Tommy couldn't hear the conversation through the glass, but he could read his mother's body language as she set down her teacup and stood behind the counter. Polite confusion shifting to concern as the big man locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. Mrs. Park rose from her chair, reaching for her purse with the universal gesture of someone preparing to leave an uncomfortable situation. The wiry man grabbed her arm with casual cruelty, forcing her back into her seat. Tommy's phone buzzed. Come inside or watch them die. He looked around desperately for options. The street was nearly empty. A few college students heading toward the bars on 23rd, a businessman hurrying toward the Mac station, nobody who looked capable of challenging 3 professional killers. The FBI safe house address glowed on his phone screen. 2847 SE Division, Apartment 4B. Agent Mitchell had promised protection, federal resources, a chance to survive this nightmare. All he had to do was walk away from his mother and hope the cartel would settle for intimidation. But Tommy Chen had been walking away from hard choices his whole life. When Richard Morrison started embezzling from the charity foundation, Tommy had looked the other way rather than confront his business partner. When the FBI offered him a plea deal that would implicate innocent colleagues, he'd kept quiet and accepted prison rather than fight for the truth. Not this time. Tommy pulled out his phone and dialed 911, but before he could speak, the operator's voice was replaced by Agent Mitchell's southern drawl. Mr. Chen, step away from the dry cleaning shop. That's an order. How are you? Never mind. They have my mother. We know. We're watching from 3 different angles, but if you go in there now, you'll just give them more hostages to work with. So I'm supposed to let them... You're supposed to trust that we know what we're doing. El Santo won't hurt civilians unless he has to. Bad for business. He wants the money and the man who found it, not random casualties. Through the shop window, Tommy watched his mother pour tea for her captors, with the same grace she'd shown every difficult customer for 2 decades. Mrs. Park sat frozen in her chair, but his mother moved with careful dignity, as if serving tea to armed killers was just another part of running a small business. Your mother's stronger than you think, Agent Mitchell continued. Korean War survivor, raised a son alone in a foreign country, built a business from nothing. She's not breaking under pressure from some cartel punk. Tommy knew the agent was right, but knowledge didn't ease the weight in his chest. His mother had sacrificed everything for his future, working double shifts so he could attend college, taking out loans against the shop to pay for his accounting certification. And he'd repaid her with disgrace and handcuffs. "What's your play here?" he asked Mitchell. "Simple economics. El Santo needs two things, his money and proof that you haven't talked to federal authorities. We give him neither. He gets desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. And if he doesn't make mistakes, then we adapt. But right now, your job is to get to the safe house and let professionals handle this." The big man inside the shop was gesturing toward the back room, where his mother kept the industrial cleaning equipment. Tommy could imagine the conversation. Empty storage space, convenient for interrogations, soundproof enough to muffle screams. His mother shook her head politely, as if declining to supersize a fast food order. The wiry man backhanded her across the face. Tommy was moving before conscious thought kicked in, crossing Morrison Street with the $20,000 bouncing against his ribs. Behind him, Agent Mitchell's voice crackled from his phone. "Chen, do not engage. That's a direct order from federal authority." But federal authority hadn't raised Tommy Chen, hadn't worked 16-hour days to put him through school, hadn't visited him every week in county lockup, while other inmates' families abandoned them to their choices. The shop's front door was locked, but Tommy still had his mother's keys from when he'd helped with deliveries during high school. He let himself in through the rear entrance, moving quietly past the industrial washers and chemical storage tanks that had provided soundtrack to his childhood. Voices from the front room, speaking in rapid Spanish. Tommy caught fragments, something about time limits and federal attention and the necessity of sending messages. Then El Santo's voice, calm and precise in English. "Mrs. Chen, your son has something that belongs to my employers. I'm hoping you can help us reach a reasonable accommodation. My son is good boy. He don't steal nothing. I'm sure you believe that. Mothers always see the best in their children, but Tommy found money that wasn't his, and now he needs to return it, along with interest for our inconvenience." Tommy peered around the doorframe and saw his mother standing behind the counter with her hands folded, facing three armed men with the same calm composure she'd shown difficult customers for 20 years. Mrs. Park huddled in her chair, tears streaming down her cheeks but otherwise silent. "How much money?" his mother asked. El Santo smiled, and Tommy understood why people crossed themselves when speaking his name. It was the smile of something that had forgotten how to be human. $52 million, Mrs. Chen, plus another $10 million for pain and suffering. Call it a round number, $62 million. Tommy's mother blinked once, the only sign that the amount had registered. "My son don't have this money." "Perhaps not. But he knows where it is. And more importantly, he knows what he's told federal authorities about our business arrangements. We need clarification on both points. Tommy don't talk to police. He good boy, but he not stupid." The wiry man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Good boys don't steal cartel money, lady." El Santo raised a hand for silence, his attention fixed on Tommy's mother with professional interest. "You raised an interesting son, Mrs. Chen. Accountant, convicted embezzler, prison graduate, and now church owner, a man of many talents. Tommy was framed for embezzlement. He too honest for own good. Honest men don't end up in federal prison. Honest men don't know how to fight dirty men." Tommy felt his chest tighten at the quiet pride in his mother's voice. She believed in his innocence, even when he'd stopped believing in it himself. El Santo checked his watch, a simple Timex that somehow looked more menacing than a gold Rolex would have. "I'm going to make you an offer, Mrs. Chen. Call your son and tell him to meet us at the church with our property. Do this, and everyone goes home to their families. Refuse, and Portland loses two respected businesswomen." Tommy's phone buzzed with another call from Agent Mitchell. He declined it and stepped into the front room, hands raised but steady. "She doesn't need to call me. I'm right here." The reaction was instantaneous. The big man's hand went to his waistband while the wiry one spun toward the sound of Tommy's voice, but El Santo simply nodded as if he'd been expecting this development. "Mr. Chen, how thoughtful of you to save us a phone call." Tommy kept his hands visible while calculating distances and odds. The front door was still locked, the back exit blocked by the big man who'd moved with surprising speed. Mrs. Park whimpered softly, and his mother's knuckles were white against the counter's edge. "Let them go. Your problem is with me." "My problem, Mr. Chen, is with anyone who interferes with my employer's property. Right now, that includes your mother, Mrs. Park, and half the FBI surveillance team watching this building." Tommy's stomach dropped. If El Santo knew about the federal surveillance, then Agent Mitchell's plan was already compromised. Which meant Tommy, his mother, and Mrs. Park were expendable assets in a game with rules he didn't understand. "What do you want?" El Santo straightened his tie with the careful precision of a man preparing for a business presentation. "I want you to return $62 million to its rightful owners. I want detailed information about your cooperation with federal authorities, and I want the names of anyone else who knows about our Portland operations. I can't give you what I don't have. We'll see." El Santo nodded to the wiry man, who produced a ceramic knife from his jacket, untraceable, undetectable by metal detectors, sharp enough to fillet a salmon or a human with equal efficiency. The blade pressed against Mrs. Park's throat, and the old woman's whimper became a prayer in Korean. "Your $62 million, Mr. Chen, plus a detailed confession about your federal cooperation. You have 30 seconds to begin talking, or Mrs. Park starts bleeding." Tommy looked at his mother, seeing 20 years of sacrifice and love reflected in her dark eyes. Then he looked at Mrs. Park, whose only crime had been sharing tea and gossip on a Tuesday evening. Finally, he looked at El Santo, who waited with the patience of a man who'd made similar offers many times before. And Tommy Chen, failed accountant and accidental church owner, made the only choice his conscience would allow. "The money's in the church, hidden in the basement. But if you hurt either of them, I'll make sure the FBI gets every detail about your operation, including the real reason Father Martinez died." El Santo's smile widened, showing teeth white as fresh snow. "Mr. Chen, I think this is going to be a very productive evening." Outside, Portland's October rain continued to fall, washing the city clean of everything except the choices that defined who people really were when darkness fell, and prayers weren't enough to keep the devils at bay. The drive back to St. Augustine's felt like a funeral procession. Tommy sat in the passenger seat of El Santo's Escalade, his mother and Mrs. Park in the back, with the wiry man whose ceramic knife never strayed far from their necks. The big man drove with the steady competence of someone who'd transported unwilling passengers before. El Santo rode in silence, occasionally checking his phone for messages that made his expression darker. Through the rain-streaked windshield, Portland's familiar streets looked foreign and threatening, as if the city itself had turned against Tommy the moment he'd discovered blood money in a house of God. "Tell me about Father Martinez," Tommy said, desperate to break the suffocating quiet. El Santo glanced at him with mild interest. "What would you like to know? How a priest ends up laundering cartel money, the same way an accountant ends up stealing from children's charities, slowly, then all at once." El Santo's voice carried no judgment, just professional observation. "Eduardo Martinez came to Portland in 1995 to minister to migrant workers. Good man, genuinely committed to helping people who had nothing. But good intentions don't pay for food banks and medical clinics." Tommy watched the Gothic spire of St. Augustine's grow larger through the windshield. Police tape still fluttered around the perimeter, but no officers were visible. Either the FBI had pulled their surveillance, or Agent Mitchell was playing a deeper game than she'd admitted. "So you recruited him?" "We didn't need to. He recruited himself." El Santo checked his watch again, that same unremarkable Timex that somehow felt more ominous than any expensive timepiece. 1997, Martinez's congregation was facing eviction. The archdiocese had written them off as unprofitable. 300 families were going to lose their spiritual home, their community center, their sanctuary in a hostile world. The Escalade pulled into the church parking lot, headlights sweeping across weathered brick and broken windows. In the back seat, Tommy's mother squeezed Mrs. Park's hand, while the wiry man smiled his broken glass smile. "I offered Father Martinez a simple business proposition," El Santo continued. "We needed secure storage for certain assets during transportation. He needed operating capital for his ministry, $10,000 per month to maintain a basement storage facility, no questions asked. And he said yes. He said yes to feeding hungry children. The money laundering was just a technical detail." Tommy understood the logic, even as it sickened him. He'd made similar rationalizations during his partnership with Richard Morrison, small compromises that seemed reasonable until they added up to federal charges and newspaper headlines. What changed? Why did he reach out to the FBI? El Santo's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been genuine regret. Cancer. Pancreatic. Stage 4. When a man knows he's dying, he starts thinking about his legacy. Eduardo wanted to make peace with God before the end. The big man parked near the church's side entrance, the same door Tommy had unlocked with brass keys that felt like artifacts from a simpler world. Through the rain, the building looked even more decrepit than it had 6 hours ago, as if secrets had weight that could crack foundations and bow walls. El Santo stepped out of the vehicle and stretched like a businessman arriving for an important meeting. "The problem with deathbed confessions, Mr. Chen, is that they implicate living people who aren't ready to meet their maker." Tommy's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Mitchell. "Federal backup is en route. Stall for 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Tommy looked at his mother, who met his eyes with calm acceptance, and at Mrs. Park, whose terror had crystallized into the kind of stillness that preceded either survival or surrender. 20 minutes felt like 20 years. "Let's go see your treasure," El Santo said, producing an umbrella as if visiting condemned churches was a regular social activity. The basement of St. Augustine's felt different now, charged with expectation and dread. Tommy led the group down the narrow stairs, El Santo behind him, followed by the wiry man escorting the two women. The big man stayed upstairs, presumably watching for federal interference. The safe stood open where Tommy had left it, stacks of cash rising like green monuments to corruption. But El Santo didn't look at the money. Instead, he studied Tommy with the focused attention of a predator calculating the best angle of attack. $52 million, Tommy said, just like you wanted. Minus 20,000 that you helped yourself to. Tommy reached inside his jacket and pulled out the sodden bills he'd taken during his escape. Water damage had turned the currency into expensive confetti, but El Santo accepted the ruined money with the same professional calm he'd shown throughout the evening. "Where's the rest?" the cartel killer asked. "What rest?" "Mr. Chen, I've been laundering money through Portland for 15 years. I know exactly how much Eduardo Martinez was holding for my employers, and it wasn't $52 million. It was $87 million. Where are the other 35 million? Tommy's mind raced through possibilities. Had Father Martinez moved some of the money before his death? Hidden it in other locations? Given it to the FBI as evidence? "I don't know about any other money. This is what I found." El Santo nodded to the wiry man, who pressed his ceramic blade against Mrs. Park's throat, hard enough to draw a thin line of blood. The old woman's prayer became a whimper, then silence. "My employers are very specific about their accounting, Mr. Chen. They don't lose track of $35 million. Someone took it, and since Eduardo is dead, that leaves a very short list of suspects. I'm telling you the truth. This is everything I found. I believe you found 52 million in this safe. But Eduardo was a careful man. He wouldn't have kept all his eggs in one basket, especially not in the months before his death when he knew federal authorities were watching him." Tommy's mother spoke for the first time since entering the church. "Maybe priest gave money away. Help poor people like Jesus would do." El Santo turned toward her with renewed interest. An interesting theory, Mrs. Chen, though it raises the question of who might have helped him distribute such a large sum without attracting attention. The implication hit Tommy like a physical blow. El Santo thought he was part of Father Martinez's operation, that he'd been working with the priest to steal cartel money, which explained the surveillance, the quick intelligence gathering, the professional approach to intimidation. "You've been watching me for months," Tommy realized, "since the day Eduardo Martinez died in federal custody. We knew he'd been cooperating with the FBI, which meant our Portland operation was compromised. We also knew he'd moved money in the weeks before his arrest. The question was, where, and with whose help?" El Santo walked to the safe and ran his fingers along the metal frame with something approaching reverence. "When we learned that Eduardo's church had been sold to a recently paroled accountant for 10 cents, the coincidence seemed unlikely." Tommy felt the walls of St. Augustine's closing in around him. He'd thought he was buying a building for the price of a dime store candy. Instead, he'd purchased a target painted on his back in blood and federal ink. "But I've never met Father Martinez. I didn't even know this place existed until this morning." "Perhaps, but you have to admit, Mr. Chen, that your story strains credibility. A convicted embezzler happens to buy the exact building where cartel money is hidden, happens to know the combination to a safe that only Eduardo and 2 of my associates ever accessed. I figured out the combination. Matthew 6:21. Yes, Eduardo's favorite verse. Very sentimental for a money launderer." El Santo checked his Timex again, and Tommy noticed a thin scar running along the man's wrist. Old, surgical, the kind left by someone who'd once tried to leave this world permanently. "But that still doesn't explain how you knew to look for a safe in the first place." Tommy opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. Because El Santo was right. The whole sequence of events did seem impossibly convenient. What were the odds that an ex-accountant would buy an abandoned church and immediately discover millions in hidden cash, unless someone had wanted him to find it? "Agent Mitchell," Tommy whispered. El Santo smiled his predatory smile. "Now you're beginning to understand the game, Mr. Chen." From upstairs, the sound of shattering glass echoed through the nave. Then gunshots, sharp, professional bursts that spoke of federal training and high-quality ammunition. The big man's voice called down in rapid Spanish, something about federal agents and tactical teams. El Santo drew a pistol from beneath his suit jacket, a compact Glock that looked like an extension of his hand. But instead of pointing it at Tommy, he aimed at the basement ceiling. "Your FBI friends are right on schedule," he said, "which confirms what I've suspected since this afternoon." More gunshots from above, closer now. Through the basement's small windows, Tommy could see tactical lights sweeping through the church's interior like electronic prayers. "You're not a random accountant who stumbled into cartel money, Mr. Chen. You're a federal asset. Agent Mitchell has been planning this operation for months, using you as unknowing bait to flush out the people responsible for Eduardo's death." Tommy felt reality shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. "That's impossible. I've never worked with the FBI. Not consciously, but consider the sequence of events. You're released from federal prison 8 months ago. You're given a job in Portland, a city where you have family but no criminal connections. You're provided with just enough money to survive, but not enough to disappear. And when a condemned church goes up for auction, somehow you're the only bidder." The wiry man was backing toward the stairs, his knife still at Mrs. Park's throat, but his attention divided between his hostages and the approaching federal agents. Tommy's mother watched everything with the calculating gaze of someone who'd survived war and poverty and understood that chaos created opportunities. "Agent Mitchell has been moving pieces on a chessboard for months," El Santo continued. "You were the knight she sacrificed to put my king in check." Tactical lights swept through the basement windows. Federal voices echoed in the nave, coordinated and professional. Tommy realized that Agent Mitchell had never intended to rescue him. She'd used him to locate both the money and the people responsible for Father Martinez's death. "But here's what your federal handler didn't anticipate," El Santo said, pressing his pistol against Tommy's temple. "I'm perfectly willing to sacrifice the night to capture the Queen." The basement door exploded inward as federal agents in tactical gear flooded down the stairs. Their flashlights turned the concrete space into a theater of shadows and stark white illumination. "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" El Santo kept his gun pressed against Tommy's head while backing toward the hole in the foundation wall, the same gap Tommy had used to escape hours earlier. The wiry man dragged Mrs. Park with him, using her as a human shield. But Tommy's mother, 68 years old and armed only with 20 years of small business experience, did something none of the tactical experts had anticipated. She stepped between the federal agents and El Santo, her grey hair catching the harsh light like a halo. "Enough," she said in English, clear as a church bell. "Nobody else dies in God's house." For a moment, the basement fell silent, except for the sound of rain against concrete. Federal agents held their positions. El Santo kept his gun against Tommy's skull, and Mrs. Park whimpered prayers in Korean. Then Agent Sarah Mitchell appeared at the bottom of the stairs, her weapon drawn but lowered, her southern accent thick with exhaustion. "Mrs. Chen is right," she said. "This ends here." El Santo laughed, a sound like breaking glass in an empty sanctuary. "Agent Mitchell, I was wondering when you'd join our little prayer meeting." "Let them go, Hector. You've got what you came for." "Do I? Because I'm still missing $35 million and a very detailed explanation about how my Portland operation was compromised." Agent Mitchell holstered her weapon, a gesture that sent visible tension through the tactical team behind her. The missing money was never in Portland. Father Martinez donated it to Catholic charities 3 months before his death. $35 million distributed to food banks, homeless shelters, and medical clinics across the Pacific Northwest. All documented, all legal, all gone. Tommy felt El Santo's grip tighten on the pistol. "And the compromised operation was compromised by your own paranoia and poor personnel choices. Father Martinez wasn't our asset. He was a dying man trying to buy his way into heaven with your money. We've been playing catch-up since the day he contacted us." "And why the elaborate setup with Mr. Chen?" Agent Mitchell looked directly at Tommy, and for the first time he saw something that might have been genuine regret in her expression. "Because we needed bait that would convince you to surface personally. Your reputation for killing federal informants made it difficult to recruit willing assistants." Tommy understood with crystalline clarity that he'd been expendable from the beginning. Not a federal asset, not a protected witness, just convenient collateral in a war between law enforcement and organized crime. But as the implications settled in his mind, something else became clear. Agent Mitchell had underestimated both El Santo's ruthlessness and his own capacity for survival. The cartel killer pressed the gun harder against Tommy's temple. "I appreciate the honesty, Agent Mitchell. It makes my next decision much easier." "What decision?" El Santo smiled his terrible smile. "Whether to kill everyone in this basement or just the federal agents." In the silence that followed, Tommy heard something that changed everything. His mother, humming softly in Korean. The same lullaby she'd sung during his childhood, when nightmares woke him, and the world seemed too large and frightening to navigate alone. It was the sound of love, in a place where love should have been impossible. And Tommy Chen, failed accountant and unwitting federal pawn, realized that some things were worth more than $52 million, or survival itself. He drove his elbow back into El Santo's ribs and threw himself toward the open safe, grabbing handfuls of cash and hurling them into the air like confetti at a funeral. In the chaos of falling money and shouting voices and muzzle flashes that lit the basement like strobe lights at a deadly disco, Tommy's mother grabbed Mrs. Park and pushed her toward the federal agents, and Agent Sarah Mitchell, who had orchestrated this entire disaster, put 3 bullets center mass into the man they called El Santo, sending Hector Morales to whatever judgment awaited people who turned murder into prayer. The gunfire echoed in St. Augustine's basement like the closing of a very expensive book, and Tommy realized that some sanctuaries could only be purchased with the currency of choice, sacrifice, and the kind of love that sang lullabies in the darkness. The Portland FBI field office at 2:30 a.m. felt like a purgatory designed by government contractors, fluorescent lights that made everyone look corpse pale, coffee that tasted like regret, and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant failing to mask decades of human desperation. Tommy sat in interview room C, his clothes still damp from the storm drain and basement confrontation, watching Agent Sarah Mitchell through reinforced glass. She'd been on the phone for 3 hours, her southern drawl growing sharper with each conversation. Even without audio, Tommy could read the body language of someone whose carefully planned operation had exploded into a public relations nightmare. 3 dead cartel operatives, a shootout in a historic church, $52 million in evidence that would take months to process, and one very inconvenient accountant who'd been used as unknowing bait in a federal operation that existed in legal grey areas darker than the Portland rain. His mother sat beside him, wrapped in an FBI-issued blanket and holding a cup of tea that had gone cold hours ago. Mrs. Park had been taken to OHSU for treatment of her knife wound, superficial but traumatic enough to require sedation. Tommy's mother had refused medical attention beyond basic first aid, claiming that surviving the Korean War made cartel kidnapping seem like Tuesday afternoon excitement. "Tommy, she said quietly, using the diminutive that always made him feel 12 years old. "This woman, this agent, she used you like disposable chopsticks." Tommy nodded, watching Mitchell pace behind the glass like a caged predator. "I should have seen it coming. The timing, the auction, everything was too convenient." "Convenient for her, not for us." His mother set down her tea with the careful precision she applied to everything, folding laundry, balancing books, surviving federal operations that treated human beings as chess pieces. "What happens now?" Before Tommy could answer, the interview room door opened, and Agent Mitchell entered with a thick folder and the expression of someone about to deliver bad news, wrapped in bureaucratic politeness. "Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, I want to apologize for the events of this evening. The operation didn't proceed as anticipated." Tommy's mother fixed the federal agent with a stare that could have frozen the Willamette River. "You used my son as bait for killers." "Ma'am, I understand your anger, but you understand nothing." His mother's English became more precise when she was angry, each word chosen like a surgical instrument. "You take good man who already suffered for other people's crimes, and you make him target for more criminals. This is justice." Agent Mitchell sat across from them and opened her folder, revealing photographs of crime scenes, financial documents, and surveillance photos that included several shots of Tommy going about his daily routine, completely unaware that federal agents were documenting his every move. "Mrs. Chen, your son wasn't randomly selected. His background made him an ideal candidate for this operation." Tommy studied the surveillance photos with growing nausea. Images of him leaving the county jail, starting work at his mother's shop, meeting with his parole officer, buying groceries at the Korean market on Powell. Months of observation, planning, manipulation. "Ideal how?" he asked. "Recently released from federal custody, which gave you credibility with criminal organizations. Clean record except for the embezzlement conviction, which suggested financial desperation without violent tendencies. Family ties that provided leverage for cooperation, and accounting skills that would make you valuable to anyone laundering money. So you set up the church auction. We influenced it. The building was already condemned, already scheduled for municipal sale. We simply ensured that other potential bidders were discouraged from participating." Tommy remembered the empty auction room, the lack of interest from salvage dealers and real estate speculators. Not coincidence. Manipulation by federal agents who needed a specific outcome to justify months of preparation. And the combination to the safe? Father Martinez provided that during his debriefing, along with detailed information about the basement layout, the money's location, and the security protocols Hector Morales used for Portland operations. Agent Mitchell pulled out another set of photographs, surveillance shots of El Santo and his associates conducting business around Portland, meeting with restaurant owners, visiting shipping facilities, transferring briefcases in parking garages. The methodical documentation of a criminal enterprise that had been operating under federal observation for years. We've been building a case against the Sinaloa cartel's Pacific Northwest operations since 2019.
But Hector Morales was careful, paranoid, and extremely violent. Every potential informant ended up dead. Every surveillance operation got compromised. Every legal avenue led to dead ends. Until Father Martinez got cancer, Tommy realized. Until Father Martinez got religion. Eduardo reached out to us 6 months before his death, offering to cooperate in exchange for immunity and protection for his congregation. But before we could establish formal cooperation, someone in the cartel suspected his loyalty. Mitchell showed them crime scene photos from the county jail, Father Martinez's cell, where he'd died of an apparent heart attack that medical examiners later determined was induced by a nearly untraceable paralytic agent. Cartel assassination in federal custody, she continued, which meant we had a leak somewhere in our operation. But we also had a dead priest who'd hidden $87 million in locations he'd never been able to reveal. Tommy's mother leaned forward, studying the photographs with the practical assessment of someone who'd seen enough death to recognize murder. So you decided to use my son to finish dead priest's work. We decided to use available resources to complete a vital operation against one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America. Available resources. Tommy tasted the phrase like poison. Is that what you call people now? Agent Mitchell's expression softened slightly, revealing something that might have been genuine regret beneath the federal authority. Mr. Chen, I won't insult your intelligence by pretending this was ideal, but Hector Morales had killed 17 people in 2 years, including federal witnesses, local police officers, and civilians who'd simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Stopping him was worth significant risk. Risk to me, not to you. Risk to everyone, including my career, my team, and any chance of bringing down the people responsible for turning Portland into a money laundering hub. Tommy studied the agent's face, looking for tells that might indicate deception. But Agent Mitchell seemed genuinely exhausted, genuinely conflicted about the methods she'd used to achieve her objectives. What happens to the money? He asked. Federal seizure under the RICO Act. $52 million will be processed as evidence, then eventually distributed to law enforcement agencies and victim compensation funds. The $35 million Father Martinez donated to charities will remain with those organizations. It was given in good faith by someone trying to make amends for his crimes. And what happens to me? Agent Mitchell closed her folder and leaned back in her chair, studying Tommy with calculating attention. That depends on your definition of justice, Mr. Chen. Meaning? Meaning you have 2 choices. Option 1, we process you as a material witness. You'll be relocated under federal protection, given a new identity, and monitored for the rest of your life. Safe, anonymous, and completely cut off from everything and everyone you've ever known. Tommy felt his mother's hand tighten on his arm. The idea of federal witness protection meant never seeing her again, never returning to Portland, never reclaiming the life that had been stolen from him by Richard Morrison's embezzlement scheme. What's option 2? Option 2 is more complicated and more dangerous. Agent Mitchell reached into her jacket and pulled out a different folder, this one marked with red security tape and federal classification stamps. Mr. Chen, how would you feel about helping us recover approximately $400 million in additional cartel assets? The number hit Tommy like a physical blow. $400 million. Enough money to fund small nations, or purchase congressional elections, or make people disappear permanently into whatever afterlife waited for those who interfered with organized crime. 400 million? Hector Morales wasn't just managing Portland operations. He was the regional coordinator for Sinaloa money laundering from Vancouver to San Francisco. We estimate he was processing nearly $2 billion annually through legitimate businesses, offshore accounts, and cryptocurrency exchanges. Agent Mitchell opened the classified folder, revealing financial documents that made the church money look like pocket change, bank routing numbers, cryptocurrency wallet addresses, real estate transactions, and business ownership records that traced a web of corruption across the entire Pacific Northwest. Before his death tonight, Morales was planning to disappear with cartel funds and start fresh somewhere without extradition treaties. We found evidence of this exit strategy in his personal effects, including detailed financial records he'd kept as insurance against his employers. Tommy's mind raced through the implications. Insurance? Criminals don't trust each other, Mr. Chen. Hector Morales had been documenting every transaction, every payment, every crime he'd committed on behalf of the Sinaloa cartel. If they'd ever decided to eliminate him, he had enough evidence to bring down their entire North American operation. And now you have that evidence. Now we have that evidence. But recovering the money requires someone with accounting expertise, criminal credibility, and most importantly, someone the remaining cartel members won't immediately recognize as a federal asset. Tommy felt the trap closing around him again. Federal agents offering choices that weren't really choices, presenting opportunities that came with prices measured in blood and years. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't ignorant about the stakes. You want me to go undercover? I want you to finish what Father Martinez started. Help us recover cartel assets, dismantle their money laundering operations, and make sure no other families go through what yours did tonight. Tommy's mother spoke for the first time in several minutes. And if he says no? Agent Mitchell met the older woman's gaze directly. Then he says no. Federal witness protection, new identity, safe life far away from Portland. That's a legitimate option, Mrs. Chen. No pressure, no manipulation, no hidden agenda. But the bad people who worked with Dead Man, they still free? Some of them. Hector Morales was the enforcement arm, but the financial network is much larger. Without someone to help us navigate the accounting and banking systems, most of those people will disappear into other countries or other criminal organizations. Tommy looked at his mother, seeing decades of sacrifice and love in her weathered features. She'd already lost him once to federal prison for crimes he hadn't committed. Now Agent Mitchell was asking her to risk losing him again, to crimes he hadn't committed, but might have to pretend to commit. What do you think, Mom? His mother was quiet for a long moment, studying the classified documents with the practical eye of someone who'd built a business from nothing and understood that every choice carried consequences that rippled through generations. Finally, she spoke. Tommy, you remember what I told you when you got arrested? When newspapers said terrible things and neighbors whispered behind our backs? You said the truth has weight. That lies might float for a while, but truth always sinks to the bottom where people can find it. Truth has weight, she repeated, but somebody has to be strong enough to lift it. Tommy understood. His mother wasn't just giving him permission to work with the FBI. She was challenging him to become the kind of person who could bear the weight of other people's secrets and still choose justice over convenience. If I do this, he said to Agent Mitchell, I want guarantees. What kind of guarantees? My mother's safety. Full protection, federal resources, whatever it takes to make sure she never becomes a target again. Done. I want regular contact. No disappearing act. No cutting off communication for operational security. She gets to know I'm alive. Reasonable. And when this is over, when you've recovered your $400 million and arrested your cartel executives, I want full exoneration for the embezzlement conviction. Public vindication, sealed records, the whole thing. Agent Mitchell hesitated. Mr. Chen, that conviction was handled by state authorities. Federal influence has limits. Then expand your limits. You used me as bait once already. This time I want something more valuable than survival. What's more valuable than survival? Tommy looked at his mother, who smiled with the fierce pride of someone who'd raised a son capable of demanding justice instead of accepting scraps. Redemption, he said. The chance to prove that some people can be trusted with the truth. Agent Mitchell was quiet for a moment, calculating political costs and operational benefits. Outside the interview room, the FBI field office continued its late-night rhythm of federal bureaucracy and law enforcement machinery. Finally, she nodded. I'll make the calls. Federal prosecutors owe me favors, and your embezzlement case has some irregularities that might justify review. Richard Morrison? Richard Morrison has been under federal investigation for 18 months. Turns out your old business partner has been stealing from more than just charity foundations. Securities fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. Mr. Morrison has quite the criminal resume. Tommy felt something shift inside his chest, like a weight he'd been carrying for years suddenly redistributing itself. Not absolution exactly, but the possibility of absolution. The chance that truth might actually have the weight his mother claimed. "So what's the plan?" he asked. Agent Mitchell smiled for the first time since entering the interview room. Not her predatory federal agent smile, but something that suggested she might actually be human beneath the bureaucratic armor. "Mr. Chen, how would you like to become the most successful money launderer on the West Coast?" Outside the FBI building, Portland's October rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for whatever sunrise would bring. And Tommy Chen, failed accountant and unwitting federal asset, prepared to discover whether redemption could be purchased with the same currency that bought corruption, or if some prices could only be paid with the kind of courage that sang lullabies in the darkness and demanded truth from a world built on convenient lies. The boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center had a view that encompassed all of Portland, the bridges spanning the Willamette like steel prayers, Mount Hood rising in the distance like a promise of permanence, and somewhere below, a small dry cleaning shop where an elderly Korean woman pressed shirts and waited for her son to come home from his latest resurrection. Tommy Chen adjusted his Italian silk tie and reviewed the financial documents spread across the conference table. Numbers that would have seemed impossible a year ago now felt routine. Cryptocurrency transfers totaling $47 million. Real estate acquisitions worth $83 million. Offshore banking relationships that spanned 12 countries, and 4 decades of carefully laundered cartel profits. The Vancouver portfolio alone represents $112 million in recoverable assets, he told the assembled federal agents, prosecutors, and financial analysts. Commercial real estate, luxury condominiums, marine facilities that have been processing cash from drug operations since the 1990s. Agent Sarah Mitchell nodded from across the table, her expression professionally neutral, but her eyes reflecting something that might have been respect. 6 months of undercover work had transformed Tommy from unwitting bait into the federal government's most valuable asset against organized crime financial networks. "What about the cryptocurrency wallets?" asked Assistant U.S. Attorney David Park, a distant cousin of Mrs. Park, whose knife wound had healed, but whose nightmares still occasionally woke her neighbors with Korean prayers for protection. $47 million in Bitcoin, Ethereum, and newer currencies I hadn't heard of 6 months ago, Tommy replied. Hector Morales was more technologically sophisticated than anyone realized. He'd been moving cartel money through digital currencies since 2016, long before most law enforcement agencies understood the technology. Tommy clicked to the next slide of his presentation. A network diagram that looked like a spiderweb designed by someone with unlimited resources and no conscience. Red lines connected legitimate businesses to shell companies, offshore accounts to cryptocurrency exchanges, real estate investments to money service businesses that existed only on paper. The beauty of Morales' system was its complexity, he continued. No single transaction was large enough to trigger federal reporting requirements, but collectively, the network was processing nearly $2 billion annually through the Pacific Northwest. District Attorney Rebecca Sanders, who bore no relation to Tommy's childhood, but had become something like a professional ally over the past months, leaned forward with the focused attention of someone calculating political benefits and criminal penalties. "How much can we recover?" Conservative estimate, $412 million in traceable assets. Aggressive estimate, assuming successful prosecution of all identified co-conspirators, $650 million. The room fell silent, except for the sound of calculators, laptops, and federal prosecutors mentally converting criminal assets into career advancement opportunities. Outside the windows, Portland's spring rain created patterns on glass like tears of joy. "Mr. Chen," Agent Mitchell said, "I think it's time you knew the full scope of what you've accomplished." She activated the room's display screen, revealing a map of North America dotted with red pins that stretched from Vancouver to Tijuana, from Miami to Seattle. Each pin represented a financial institution, business, or individual that had been identified through Tommy's undercover work. 87 arrests across 6 states and 2 countries, $412 million in recovered assets. The complete dismantling of the Sinaloa cartel's North American money laundering network. Mitchell paused, looking directly at Tommy, and the exoneration of one accountant who was framed for crimes he didn't commit. Tommy felt his chest tighten with something that might have been relief, vindication, or simple exhaustion. 6 months of living as someone else, pretending to be the kind of person who could launder cartel money without losing sleep, had taken a toll that no amount of recovered assets could fully repay. "Richard Morrison?" he asked. District Attorney Sanders smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd built her career on putting wealthy criminals in federal cages. Pleaded guilty to 14 counts of embezzlement, securities fraud, and money laundering. Currently serving 12 years in the same minimum security facility where you spent 8 months for crimes he committed. And the charity foundation? Full restitution, plus interest and penalties. Your name has been cleared from all criminal records, and the foundation's board has extended a formal apology for their role in your wrongful conviction. Tommy closed his eyes and listened to the sound of rain against corporate glass. Justice, it turned out, had a sound. Not the crash of gavels or the slam of cell doors, but the quiet whisper of truth, finally finding its way to the surface. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. "Tommy, Mrs. Park made kimchi. Come home for dinner. Bring federal friends if they promise to eat vegetables." The federal friends in question were still discussing asset forfeiture procedures and prosecutorial strategies, but Tommy was thinking about kimchi and clean clothes, and the small miracles that survived even the most complicated forms of justice. "There's something else," Agent Mitchell said, interrupting his thoughts. She handed him a folder marked with the same red security tape that had started this entire odyssey 6 months earlier. But this folder was thinner, more personal, with his name written in careful script across the cover. "From Father Martinez," she explained. "We found it in his personal effects, sealed and marked for delivery in the event of his death. The prison chaplain held it until we could verify your identity and circumstances." Tommy opened the folder with hands that had learned to forge signatures, manipulate currency exchanges, and navigate the shadow world where millions of dollars moved like digital ghosts through electronic networks that existed beyond traditional concepts of law and geography. Inside was a single handwritten letter on St. Augustine's letterhead, dated 3 days before Father Martinez's death. "Mr. Chen, if you are reading this, then God's plan has unfolded in ways I could not have anticipated, but can only accept with humble gratitude. Agent Mitchell has told me about your background, your wrongful conviction, and your family's sacrifice for justice that seemed impossible to achieve. I want you to know that the money you found in my church was never mine to give or keep. It belonged to people whose lives were destroyed by the same criminal organization that has now targeted you. I tried to return it to its rightful owners, the communities devastated by drug trafficking, the families torn apart by violence, the children who lost parents to a war fought with bullets and bank transfers. But I failed. Cancer and federal custody prevented me from completing that mission. If you are reading this letter, then perhaps God has chosen you to finish what I could not. The money you discovered was never a treasure. It was a burden, a responsibility, a test of character that I was not strong enough to pass. I pray that you are stronger than I was. I pray that you can find a way to transform something born of greed and violence into something that serves love and justice. The combination to the safe was Matthew 6:21. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I chose those numbers because I wanted whoever found the money to understand that true treasure cannot be counted in dollars or hidden in basement walls. True treasure is found in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the love we show to strangers, in the courage we find to do what is right even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. You bought my church for 10 cents, Mr. Chen, but I believe you paid a much higher price than you knew. May God bless your journey toward whatever redemption awaits us all. In faith and hope, Father Eduardo Martinez Tommy read the letter twice, feeling the weight of words written by a dying man who'd somehow seen the future clearly enough to leave guidance for someone he'd never met. Around the conference table, federal agents continued their discussions about asset recovery and criminal prosecution, but Tommy was thinking about 10 cents and $52 million, and the distance between them that could only be measured in choices. "Mr. Chen?" Agent Mitchell's voice brought him back to the present. "Is everything all right?" Tommy folded Father Martinez's letter and slipped it into his jacket pocket, next to his heart where it belonged. "Agent Mitchell, I have a proposal." "What kind of proposal?" "The $412 million we've recovered. What happens to it after the legal proceedings?" "Standard federal asset forfeiture, distributed to law enforcement agencies, victim compensation funds, federal prosecutors' offices, The usual bureaucratic allocation. What if there was a better way? Tommy stood and walked to the windows, looking down at Portland's skyline, where somewhere his mother was pressing clothes and Mrs. Park was making kimchi, and ordinary people were living ordinary lives in a city that had been secretly serving as a highway for dirty money. Father Martinez wanted to return stolen money to the communities that had been damaged by the crimes. What if we honored that intention? District Attorney Sanders looked up from her notes with the sharp attention of someone who'd learned to recognize political opportunities disguised as moral imperatives. What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Chen? I'm suggesting we establish a foundation. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation for Community Restoration. $400 million dedicated to repairing damage caused by drug trafficking and money laundering in the Pacific Northwest. Agent Mitchell frowned. Mr. Chen, federal asset forfeiture has specific legal requirements, which can be modified by court order if there's sufficient justification and community support. Tommy interrupted. I've spent 6 months learning how money moves through legal systems. I've also learned that the same mechanisms used for laundering criminal assets can be used for legitimate charitable purposes. He turned from the windows to face the assembled federal officials, feeling something he hadn't experienced since before his wrongful conviction, the absolute certainty that he was proposing something right and necessary and achievable. Food banks for families affected by drug addiction, medical clinics for communities that lost healthcare funding to cartel violence, educational programs for children whose parents were incarcerated for drug offenses, housing assistance for families displaced by drug-related crime. Assistant U.S. Attorney Park was taking notes, his expression shifting from skepticism to professional interest. The legal precedent would be complicated, but not impossible. The political benefits would be substantial, District Attorney Sanders added, with the calculated enthusiasm of someone who understood that justice and public relations were often the same thing approached from different angles. Agent Mitchell was quiet for a long moment, studying Tommy with the same attention she'd shown during their first phone call 6 months earlier. But this time, her expression suggested evaluation, rather than manipulation. Mr. Chen, 6 months ago you were a target. 3 months ago you were an asset. Today, you're proposing to become something else entirely. What's that? A person who keeps promises to dead priests. Tommy smiled, feeling Father Martinez's letter rest against his chest like a talisman. Agent Mitchell, I've been a lot of things in the past year. Failed accountant, wrongful convict, unwitting federal bait, successful money launderer. But I've never been someone who could sleep peacefully knowing I had the power to transform blood money into something that might actually help people. And your mother? How does she feel about her son becoming a professional philanthropist? Tommy pulled out his phone and showed them the text about kimchi and dinner and federal friends who promised to eat vegetables. My mother thinks justice tastes better when it's shared with people you love. 3 months later, the dedication ceremony for the Eduardo Martinez Foundation took place on a warm August morning in the restored sanctuary of St. Augustine's Catholic Church. Tommy had purchased the building properly this time, for $400,000 donated by the Federal Asset Recovery Fund, plus volunteer labor from community organizations that had received the foundation's first grants. The stained glass windows had been repaired with glass that told new stories, not biblical scenes, but images of families reunited, children in classrooms, medical workers serving communities that had been forgotten by more conventional forms of justice. Tommy's mother sat in the front pew, wearing her best dress and the expression of someone who'd lived long enough to see impossible things become routine. Beside her, Mrs. Park held a small bouquet of flowers from her garden, her knife scar barely visible beneath carefully applied makeup. Agent Sarah Mitchell stood at the podium, reading from prepared remarks about federal cooperation and community partnership, but her eyes kept drifting to the basement stairs where she'd once orchestrated a deadly confrontation between federal agents and cartel killers. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation represents a new model for criminal justice, she told the assembled crowd of federal officials, community leaders, and local residents who'd watched their neighborhood transform from a money laundering hub into something that might actually deserve the word sanctuary. Instead of simply punishing criminal behavior, we're investing recovered assets in the communities that were damaged by those crimes. Instead of hiding dirty money in federal bureaucracy, we're using it to fund clean solutions to problems that government programs couldn't address. Tommy listened from his seat beside the altar, thinking about numbers that told stories more complicated than any spreadsheet could capture. $412 million recovered from cartel operations, 87 criminal convictions across 6 states, 12 medical clinics established in communities that had lost healthcare funding to drug-related violence, 34 food banks serving families affected by addiction, 116 educational scholarships for children whose parents had been incarcerated for drug offenses. But there were other numbers that mattered more. One letter from a dying priest who'd seen redemption, where others saw only crime. One mother who'd sung lullabies in basement darkness and demanded that federal agents eat vegetables. One 10-cent church purchase that had cost everything and paid for more than anyone could have calculated. Agent Mitchell finished her remarks and introduced Tommy as the Foundation's executive director, a title that still felt like it belonged to someone else, someone more qualified, more respectable, more deserving of the second chance that justice had finally provided. He approached the podium and looked out at faces that represented every complicated choice he'd made since buying an abandoned church for the price of a dime store candy. Federal agents who'd used him as bait, community leaders who'd watched their neighborhoods become casualties in a war fought with money and violence, families who'd received foundation grants and discovered that sometimes help came from the most unlikely sources. Father Martinez wrote in his final letter that true treasure cannot be counted in dollars or hidden in basement walls. Tommy began, his voice carrying clearly through the restored sanctuary. He believed that real wealth is found in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the love we show to strangers, in the courage we find to do what's right, even when it costs us everything we thought we wanted. He paused, looking toward the basement stairs, where $52 million had waited for someone brave enough or desperate enough to discover that money was just paper until people decided what it meant. 6 months ago, I thought justice was something that happened to other people, something that rich people could buy and poor people couldn't afford, something that had more to do with lawyers and judges than with truth and consequences. Tommy pulled Father Martinez's letter from his jacket pocket, the paper worn soft from constant handling, but the words still clear enough to guide decisions about money and meaning and the distance between them that could only be crossed by people willing to pay whatever price redemption demanded. But I've learned that justice isn't something you buy or sell or hide in basement safes. Justice is something you build, one choice at a time, one person at a time, one community at a time. It's something you create when you decide that other people's suffering matters more than your own safety. He folded the letter and returned it to his pocket, where it would remain until he no longer needed reminders about the difference between treasure and wealth, between survival and redemption, between the price of things and their actual value. The Eduardo Martinez Foundation isn't just about recovered cartel money or federal asset forfeiture or community restoration programs. It's about the truth that Father Martinez understood when he chose to cooperate with federal authorities, even though he knew it would cost him his life. Tommy looked directly at his mother, who smiled with the fierce pride of someone who'd raised a son, capable of transforming blood money into something that might actually serve love and justice. The truth that some debts can only be paid forward, some treasures can only be found by giving them away, and some churches can only be bought with the kind of currency that costs everything and pays for more than anyone thought possible. Outside St. Augustine's restored windows, Portland's summer sunshine painted the sanctuary in colors that suggested hope rather than desperation, redemption rather than mere survival. And Tommy Chen, former accountant and current guardian of other people's second chances, prepared to spend the rest of his life learning what it meant to transform 10 cents into $52 million into $400 million into something that couldn't be counted in any currency except the kind that measured love, justice, and the possibility that broken things could be made whole if enough people cared enough to do the work of healing. The ceremony ended with a prayer offered in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Korean, because redemption, like mathematics, was a universal language that transcended the borders that people drew to separate themselves from each other's pain and possibility. And in the basement of St. Augustine's Catholic Church, where an empty safe stood open like a promise that some secrets were meant to be shared, the sound of children's laughter drifted down from the new community center that had been built with money that had once purchased only silence, fear, and the kind of emptiness that echoed in spaces where love should have been, but was never allowed to take root. Tommy Chen had bought a church for 10 cents and found $52 million. But in the end, he'd learned that the most valuable thing he'd discovered wasn't money at all. It was the truth that some purchases could only be made with courage, some profits could only be counted in other people's joy, and some churches could only be consecrated by people brave enough to believe that redemption was always possible, even for accountants who'd lost their way and found it again in the most unlikely sanctuary of all.